and this reckless power grab. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today in recognition of the one-year anniversary of Superstorm Sandy's landfall on the Northeast and the destruction that it brought to a ruinous path through Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. And I will be joined today on the floor and ask unanimous consent that we be permitted to engage in a colloquy by my colleagues from New York, Senator Schumer, and from Rhode Island, Senator Whitehouse, if there is no objection.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I can scarcely capture in words the awesome, monstrous power of this storm as it hit the Northeast. And as I traveled through it, I was near the coastline of Connecticut, traveling some of the roads in the midst of this storm as it ripped through my state, tearing apart communities along our coast, destroying homes and businesses, displacing families, forever altering the shoreline itself. And anybody who questions the power of nature at its most destructive should have seen this storm as it unfolded and the damage that it left in its wake. In fact, in Connecticut, $770 million in damages. And what I remember from touring Connecticut is not only the size and magnitude of destruction, but also the resilience and strength of Connecticut's people as they struggled through the pain and anguish of coping with this devastation, wondering how they would ever rebuild. And in fact, they have rebuilt with that courage and relentless strength and fortitude that has so marked the character of Connecticut and New England and New York as they rallied around one another and exhibited that sense of optimism and hope, which was as important as any material resources that were brought to bear. They rallied around each other with gratitude and with hope because they had each other, and they have succeeded in clearing the debris, reconstructing, rebuilding in a way that is inspiring. I only wish that Congress's response was as effective and courageous as the citizens of Connecticut that I viewed in the storm's aftermath. The Senate was slow to act, but it was before the House in passing the $60 billion recovery package for the Northeast. And the effort was stalled in the House, quite bluntly, by partisan politics of the worst kind and trivial obstruction. And there are lessons to be learned here. Number one, that partisanship and politics should have no role in our response to disasters, whether in Oklahoma or Colorado or Louisiana or the Northeast. We are all in this effort together when disaster strikes. We should rally around each other as the people of Connecticut rallied. And our response has to be quicker, smarter, stronger than it was in this instance. We owe it, again, to ourselves as well as to people who have suffered financial and emotional loss, and many of them physical injury as a result of this kind of natural disaster. Those two lessons are reinforced by a third, which is these superstorms have become the new normal. We can no longer regard the one-in-a-century storm as one every 100 years. They are coming once every year because climate disruption is, in fact, increasing their frequency and force in a way that is awesome and alarming and astonishing. And so another lesson here is that there has to be preparation to prevent damage, to mitigate the effects of these storms when they strike. And the investments, and they are investments, have to be smart and strong in means such as storm barriers, breakers, better shoreline resilience. Eventually, the federal government provided aid, and Connecticut has put it to good use, the $200 million that were distributed through the National Flood Insurance Plan to homeowners and business owners. Cities and towns around my state have used $42 million in FEMA assistance, and more than $10 million have gone to health services and facilities. And as our governor announced just yesterday, an additional $65 million have been granted to the state to supplement the initial $72 million from the Department of Housing and Urban Development in the form of community development block grants for disaster relief. These new federal dollars are critical to the effort of rebuilding, and I will continue to fight not only for additional funds, but also against the bureaucratic log jams and red tape that have prevented so many from receiving more timely aid. This aid has come too slow, it has been too small, and it has been behind the efforts in time and strength of Connecticut's people. And I will continue to fight for increased aid, including from the $100 million that was announced yesterday and today's announcement of the U.S. Department of Interior of $100 million in the coastline resiliency projects. I will support all qualified applicants from Connecticut securing some of this competitive funding, and we will fight for a fair allocation of this money to benefit the important work that Connecticut is doing to strengthen our coastline so that we will prevent and reduce the effects of these storms in the future. I had the privilege to travel the state as a leader of a listening tour for the Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force this past May, just over the half-year mark from the time that Sandy hit. The progress made with this help from the federal government, combined with the goodwill, drive, and sense of responsibility toward one another exemplified by the people of Connecticut, has been remarkable. But we must resolve to do better at the federal level. And I hope that not only the storm itself, but the shortcomings of the relief effort will be a teaching moment for the nation. Because the evidence is irrefutable that climate disruption is impacting our oceans and atmosphere and leading to an increasing number of severe weather storms, events across the country that we cannot control. And we will see more such monstrous storms here and in other parts of the country. I want to thank my colleagues, many of us like Senator Whitehouse and Senator Schumer, who have been such strong and steadfast leaders in this effort to recognize the effects of climate disruption and prepare for them. Connecticut is in the process of upgrading our infrastructure to strengthen our resiliency among the most vulnerable communities. We're investing in microgrids, often powered by hydrogen fuel cells that are manufactured in our state to provide backup power for hospitals and senior communities in towns like Preston and Franklin, which I visited in the aftermath of the storm. In Milford, residents are using HUD funding to elevate their homes and guard against these kinds of storm surges. And in other coastal towns, green infrastructure is being employed with marsh grass to slow surging waters during storms. In Stamford, Connecticut, my hometown, the city is using federal aid to upgrade a 17-foot hurricane barrier by replacing manual pumps to insure against damage to the city's communities in future storms. I visited the shoreline of Stamford, as I did up and down the coast of Connecticut. And I have since, to see how Connecticut is learning these lessons to reduce dollar costs as well as human costs. These improvements taking place across Connecticut speak volumes to our strength of will and mind and the determined character of our people in Connecticut. And I express appreciation to colleagues like Senator Schumer and White House and others in this body who helped us in a time of need, came forth to provide encouragement and support and to assure that the people of Connecticut are not alone. No one in the United States struck by natural disaster, whether it is in the presiding officer's state of West Virginia or in the westernmost part of Hawaii, should be alone in times of natural disaster. That is what we do together. We come together. We rally together. And I thank the President, and I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Before I join the colloquy with Senators Blumenthal and Schumer, let me do two bits of housekeeping. I've been asked to request unanimous consent that at 5 p.m. today, all post-cloture time on the Griffin nomination be yielded back and the Senate proceed to vote without intervening action or debate. The motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, that no further motions be in order, that any related statements be printed in the record, that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate then resume legislative session.
Is there objection? Without objection.
And may I also ask unanimous consent that Aaron Goldner and Danielle Schreiber, who are two fellows in my office, be granted floor privileges for the remainder of this Congress.
Without objection.
Mr. President, this is my 48th trip to the floor to remind Congress that it is time to wake up to the threat of climate change. I'm joined here by Senators Blumenthal and Schumer because 1 year ago today, Hurricane Sandy struck our states with frightening force. Now, a year later, communities across the Northeast have dug out and are rebuilding. But Sandy left a permanent mark on our coasts and on our consciousness. To be sure, we cannot say that this devastating storm was specifically caused by climate change. However, Sandy showed the many ways we are vulnerable to the undeniable effects of climate change, like rising sea levels and warming oceans, effects that can in turn load the dice for more damaging storms. As evening fell on October 29, 2012, a storm surge from the largest Atlantic hurricane ever recorded swept against Rhode Island's shores, about 5 feet above mean sea level. A few hours later, waters peaked around New York City, about 9 feet above mean sea level. A harrowing night followed for victims of Hurricane Sandy, a night that took more than 150 lives and caused $65 billion in physical damage and economic loss. Hurricane Sandy, or Superstorm Sandy as many remember it, hit 24 states with direct effects. Floodwaters invaded homes and swept out roads. High winds knocked out power to 8.5 million homes and businesses, cutting a swath of darkness that could be seen from space. An entire New York neighborhood was gutted by fires that emergency personnel could not reach through the storm. Sandy flooded nearly the entire coastline, with beaches and dunes driven down by the waves and wind. Displaced sand and stone covered roads like here on Atlantic Avenue in Mesquamacut, Rhode Island. Houses were swept off their foundations in Rhode Island's southern coast communities like Matunic, shown in this photo. Here we see Governor Lincoln Chafee, a former member of this body, surveying the damage to these homes. President Obama granted Governor Chafee's request for a federal disaster declaration covering 4 of Rhode Island's 5 counties. More than 130,000 Rhode Islanders lost power. 8 cities and towns implemented evacuation actions. Nearly a third of all Rhode Islanders were directly affected one way or another. And in a close-knit state like ours, nearly everyone was touched by Sandy. Rhode Islanders are resilient, and we are recovering. Over $30 million has been paid out to Rhode Islanders for more than 1,000 federal flood insurance claims. FEMA has approved more than 260 projects for reimbursement. Over $12 million has been put to repairing our state's parks, wildlife refuges, and historic sites. Individuals and families received more than $423,000 in grants to meet their immediate basic needs for housing and other essential disaster-related expenses. The federal government will always play a central role for communities like ours picking up after a disaster like Sandy. So it would make sense for the federal government to learn from these events and be smart as we plan for future risks. The Government Accountability Office recently reported on the risks to U.S. infrastructure posed by climate change. Roads, bridges, and water systems are designed to operate for 50 to 100 years. Well, 50 to 100 years from now, our climate and our coastline will be very different. Sandy threw at Rhode Island's shores Atlantic seas that had risen almost 10 inches since the 1930s, against a shoreline that had already retreated more than 100 feet in some locations. As climate change progresses, more and more infrastructure will be exposed to more and more risk. Earlier this year, GAO added to its high-risk list the United States financial exposure to climate change. GAO, our congressional watchdog, now warns that it is fiscally irresponsible to ignore the signs of climate change. The President's Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force and his Climate Action Plan both call for adaptation to this risk from climate change, particularly for better coastal resiliency and preparedness. Here's an example of doing it right. When Hurricane Katrina hit the I-10 twin-span bridge that crosses Lake Pontchartrain near New Orleans, it twisted and toppled the bridge's 255-ton concrete bridge spans off their piers and into the lake. The bridge was rebuilt using Federal Highway Administration funding, but they built it stronger. They built it better engineered, and in some sections they built it more than 20 feet higher. It makes sense to make sure that our agencies repair American infrastructure to the common sense standard that it's ready for future risks. Rebuilding to the specs that failed is not common sense. Being deliberately stupid in order to deny climate change is a losing proposition. Well, Congress can do something smart right now. We could pass the Water Resources and Development Act with the resiliency and restoration provisions that were in the Senate-passed bipartisan bill. Congress could support the President's Climate Action Plan using our wise Earth's natural protections for our coastal infrastructure. Of course, even robust climate adaptation won't let us off the hook in some places. New England can build levees and dams to hold the waters back, but the vast low areas of southeastern Florida are porous limestone. And even if you built a giant dike, the water would just seep in through the underlying limestone. A study last year found that 3 feet of sea level rise, which is what we presently expect, will hit more than 1.5 million Floridians and nearly 900,000 Florida homes, almost double the effect on any other state in the nation. So Florida should want to prevent as much climate change as possible, and that means cutting carbon pollution. Ultimately, for the open market to work, we need to include the full cost of carbon pollution in the price of fossil fuels. Anything less is a subsidy to polluters. What Florida should want is for Congress to enact a carbon pollution fee to correct the market, and then return that fee to American families. Ultimately, inaction is irresponsible, and Americans get it. 82% of Americans believe we should start preparing now for rising sea levels and severe storms from climate change. And young Americans in particular see through the phony climate denial message. Get this, three-quarters of independent young voters and more than half of Republican young voters would describe climate deniers as, I quote, ignorant, out of touch, or crazy. Let me repeat that. The majority of Republican voters under 35 would describe climate deniers as crazy, ignorant, or out of touch. Continuing the climate denial strategy is not a winning proposition for our friends on the other side. Even their own young voters see through it. Congress should wake up to the alarms that are ringing in nature and to the voices of the American people. One of the loudest alarm gongs was Hurricane Sandy. Voltaire said, "Men argue, nature acts." Well, nature acted, driving epic winds and seas against our shores, and she will continue to act if we continue to tip her careful balances with reckless carbon pollution and shameless subsidies to the big polluters. We need to wake up as a Congress and take responsible action to protect our homes and communities. We need to remember Sandy and learn her lessons. I yield the floor to my distinguished colleague from New York.
Well, first I want to thank my colleague from
Senator from New York.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank my colleague from Rhode Island, the senator from Rhode Island, for calling us together, Senator Blumenthal and I and others, and for taking action on climate change. There has been no one in this body who has done more to sound the alarm about climate change. I've enjoyed his regular time to wake up speeches. I guess this is number 49 and 48, his 48th. One of them was so good I read it twice. But he's been relentless on this issue in a positive, articulate, and superb way. And there couldn't be a better day to talk about climate change than today, because we are the one-year anniversary of Superstorm Sandy. Senators Whitehouse and Blumenthal and I remember it vividly, each visiting our communities on the days afterwards and seeing the terrible, terrible blow that Sandy delivered to New York, to the whole East Coast, creating such damage, throwing such upheaval into communities and lives. And I'd like to say, Mr. President, I think Sandy was a horrible event, but the one good thing, the one silver lining in this awful and large cloud is that people take climate change more seriously. I think most Americans agreed that climate change was real, but there was not a sense of urgency about climate change pre-Sandy. People said, well, it's happening, it's 25 years from now or 50 years from now. Unlike Senator Whitehouse, who has a passion and a sense of urgency daily and immediately about this bill, most people said we can let things wait. So, unfortunately, despite the efforts of the senator from Rhode Island and others, our bodies are not doing enough on climate change. But when Sandy occurred, a sea change occurred. Americans understood, those of us in the Northeast probably more than anybody else, that we could not afford to wait. It took 10 years to get the American people to accept the fact that climate change is real. It took one storm to get them to understand that we had to move immediately. And Sandy was awful. In the days after the storm, I toured places like Rockaway, Long Beach, Staten Island, Lindenhurst. Whole neighborhoods were leveled. Thousands of New Yorkers were homeless. Mr. President, to see an elderly gentleman, Mr. Romano, sitting in front of his lot on the Great South Bay in Lindenhurst, his house totally destroyed. He was sitting in one of his few possessions left, a little lawn chair, was devastating. And I asked Mr. Romano, well, you're going to move? He said, look at the view. 2 days after Sandy, the skies were peaceful, the sun was beautiful, and it was reflected off the Great South Bay. He said, every year I've had 364 good days and one bad day I'm not moving. And that story can be repeated, but the devastation was real. To drive down the streets of the Rockaways, or of Long Beach, or of Staten Island, the South Shore of Staten Island, and see in house after house just piles in front of the house, not just furniture, although that was a problem. We all have our favorite chair, our favorite place to sit. But people's lives were ripped apart, heirlooms that had been in the family for generations, pictures and albums, gone like that. And this is an example of one of the places that was hurt the worst, Breezy Point, a hardy community, cops, firefighters, teachers, EMT workers, the heart of New York City's middle class, the very same people, and many did from Breezy Point, who rushed the towers on 9/11 and some lost their lives, were the people who were devastated here. And a fire erupted. 120 houses. It looked like Dresden after the bombings in World War II. And all that left was this religious shrine. I'll never forget that scene and having the local firefighters come show me what had happened. And then, of course, our infrastructure was terribly damaged as well. Here we have the R train, which Secretary Fox and I just announced is going to be up and ready in a year. The tunnel had millions of gallons of water, brackish water, salty water, that not only ruined the infrastructure of the tunnels, but the signals that depended on electric functioning gone. And these scenes can be repeated over and over again. But what Sandy did, Mr. President, is made climate change real for New Yorkers in a horrible way. The same thing is now happening across the country. So what Sandy did was not alert us to the fact that climate change existed, but alerted us it was a call to action. While climate scientists try to avoid blaming any single weather event on climate change, we know that a warming planet can load the dice for more frequent and extreme storms. And as sure as we all are sitting here, there will be other storms, unfortunately, God forbid, but in all likelihood of Sandy's devastation, that will affect different parts of the country. And as I and others have said in the days after Sandy, we have had far too many events over the past 3 years in New York, Irene, Lee, then Sandy, to think we can ignore the impact of a warming planet and the impact that is having on our communities. And even if you deny the scientific reality of climate change, there is little dispute over the stark challenge facing our country. The weather is more dangerous than ever and threatens our economy. According to recent polling, Americans now support taking action on climate change to protect our children and grandchildren. So we need to do two things at once. We need to decrease our reliance on fossil fuels to slow down the warming of the planet, and we have to start investing in real climate adaptation projects in the most vulnerable parts of the country. And my colleague from Rhode Island talked about the devastation of Florida. He's right. The Florida delegation should be up in arms. I know some of our colleagues, they tend to be on this side of the aisle, are, but we hear silence from the other side of the aisle on climate change. And in just a generation, a good percentage of Florida will be out of commission. Miami, one of the largest cities in the country, is virtually unprotected when it comes to climate change. So we have to do both these things. And 1 year after Sandy, I'm pleased that we have made some progress. The Sandy relief law that we passed earlier this year provided an injection of billions of dollars into mitigation into the East Coast. When we rebuild this subway line, the signals are going to be higher up, so if, God forbid, there's another flood, they won't be out of commission. At the entrances to the various tunnels, hundreds of thousands of people take this every week. There will be gates or a certain kind of airbag that can instantaneously prevent the tunnel from being flooded. We're elevating homes and building new flood walls, dunes, to prevent damage from the next Sandy. So that's one thing we're doing, mitigation. And those of us, Senator Whitehouse, Senator Blumenthal, the others from the New Jersey and Maryland and Pennsylvania and Delaware and New York and Connecticut and Massachusetts and Rhode Island delegations, we made sure in this legislation there was ample money for mitigation so that if or when, God forbid, another storm like Sandy occurs, we'll be better protected. But second, the President took a bold and important step in releasing his climate action plan. Now, that is a critical blueprint for reducing carbon pollution. The plan lays out a framework for implementing new mitigation plans for federal, state, and local governments by tying federal funding to new standards on climate adaptation. We know the simple economic truth of investing in mitigation projects. They save money. According to research, for every $1 we invest in mitigation, we save $4 down the road because things will be protected and the taxpayers won't have to shell out the same dollars again and again and again. So it really doesn't matter what side of the climate change debate you're on when it comes to investing in mitigation. Being pro-mitigation makes good fiscal sense for the federal government. A recent study found that federal taxpayers spent $136 billion on disaster relief in just the 3 years of 2011, 12, and 13, $400 per household. The only way we can shrink this burden for the American people over time is to make critical mitigation investments at the same time we fight climate change by cutting carbon pollution. I'd like to specifically mention one piece of legislation that my colleague from Rhode Island also mentioned. He's on the EPW committee, and he has championed it with many of our colleagues. WRDA, the Bipartisan Water Resources Development Act, got 83 votes in the Senate, will be a real boost for investment in climate adaptation. In the bill, there's a new program called WIFIA, the very successful TIFIA program, which, for instance, without the taxpayers spending a nickel, local taxpayers spending a nickel, and will bring our subway system all the way over to the far west side. And I look forward to opening it up with the mayor soon. Well, modeled on that is WIFIA. It helps local governments invest in mitigation projects by providing low-interest loans, and the new bank is designed to attract private investment into these projects. There are also new authorities that will allow the Army Corps to expedite and prioritize hurricane protection studies and project recommendations. I want to thank my colleagues, led by Senator Boxer of the EPW Committee, for working with us to draft some of this language. The new policies are very important for New York and the states affected by Sandy, and I would urge our colleagues in the House to work with us to include these items in the WRDA conference. We need to use the tragedy of Sandy to learn how to make our cities and towns stronger for the next storm. We know it's coming. We have to work at the local level in terms of mitigation. We have to work at the macro level to reduce the amount of carbon that is poured into our atmosphere that will just devastate the planet if we continue to sit on our hands. So, I'd like to close my remarks, Mr. President, by borrowing a simple refrain from my friend from Rhode Island. As his poster says, it's time to wake up. Superstorm Sandy was New York's wake-up call. Let's honor the thousands of victims of that event by investing in our future. I yield the floor.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, before I depart the floor, and while Senator Schumer and Blumenthal are here, I would like to add a point that is a personal observation of mine as a senator, and that is that, first, the senator from New York is widely and properly regarded as one of the more formidable presences in the United States Senate. Having witnessed the difficulties that Senator Blumenthal discussed at getting the Sandy disaster relief out and done, I will say that we learned that Senator Schumer has an even higher gear when it comes to the urgent needs of his home state and of his coast, when his New York City lies battered and drowned by storm. The work that he did to make sure that a reluctant House passed this relief for us was an exercise in legislative craftsmanship and personal vigor that many of us will long remember. And of course, I have seen Senator Blumenthal fighting for his people in Connecticut, both after Hurricane Sandy and, of course, after the terrible tragedy that Connecticut experienced when a crazed gunman went into an elementary school and began to murder Connecticut's children. And so Senator Blumenthal, in responding to those cares, concerns, and crises of his home state of Connecticut, has been really exemplary, and it has been a privilege for me as a senator to see these two gentlemen in action in their causes that I have just mentioned. So I yield the floor.
And I'm sure Senator Blumenthal joins me in this. I'd like to say to my dear friend, and he truly is a dear friend from Rhode Island, that his generosity of word and spirit is only equaled by his intelligence, his diligence, and his foresightedness, not only on this issue, but on so many other issues that we work with, that we're working on. In fact, we're going to make a call in a few minutes, he and I and a few of our colleagues, I think Senator Blumenthal as well, to talk about another aspect of his. He's just such an intelligent thinker, and he's thinking ahead of the curve, climate change. But delivery system reform in our health care system is another place that Sheldon Whitehouse has taken leadership. And so I want to thank him for his kind words and just say, right back at you, babe. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Connecticut.
I'd like to just thank both of my colleagues. I'm not sure that I can match their eloquence in describing their gifts and their contributions on this issue and so many others, but I hope that they and others will join me in seeking to meet with the President Sandy Task Force and seeking to remedy or correct perhaps some of the log jams and red tape and deficiencies in process that led the people of our states to wait for so long before they saw relief in practical terms. And so I want to thank them for their eloquence today, for their truly formidable contribution on the issue of climate change and global warming, and to thank them also for the very powerful contribution they've made on the response to Storm Sandy that affected so many people in Connecticut. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Ohio.
Mr. President, I rise today to talk about an opportunity, actually something good that this body could do for the American people and for our economy and for the taxpayers. Tomorrow, the Senate Budget Conference that was established as part of this recent agreement that was made over reopening the government and extending the debt limit will meet. This will be the first public meeting of the group. We've had some other meetings, including the one I just had with some of the members of that group. But this is the first opportunity for us to meet as House members, Senate members, Republicans and Democrats in this budget conference. And it couldn't come soon enough. The opportunity we have with this group is that in the wake of what happened at the beginning of this month, which was, again, a government shutdown and then a debt limit debate and then pushing right up against the debt limit, the opportunity we have now is to finally deal with this issue of government shutdowns and to deal with the underlying problem of overspending that forces us to extend the debt limit time and time again. So let's start with the government shutdowns. The agreement that was agreed to opened government for 3 months. That's right. In January, we once again come to this cliff where government shuts down unless we act. So Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, everybody. In January, we hit this again. It doesn't have to be that way. Earlier this year, I introduced with Senator Tester from Montana bipartisan legislation that would have prevented the last shutdown and would prevent all shutdowns in the future. It's called, appropriately, the End Government Shutdowns Act. And it's really pretty simple. And it addresses several critical issues that we saw firsthand during this last shutdown. It would end the chaos that we saw on federal services and citizens who depend on them. It would give government agencies the predictability they need to plan their budgets based on these appropriations levels. It would add certainty to the economy. And more certainty in the economy is certainly needed right now. We should try to bring back the jobs. It would also take away the pressure for these haphazard last-minute budget deals, which inevitably have stuck in them little provisions that nobody finds out about because they're all done at the last minute to avoid a government shutdown. So here's how this would work. When we don't have spending bills agreed to by the time the fiscal year comes to an end, and that would be October 1st, then the spending continues just as it was the previous year. So same level of spending. Except that automatically it would begin to reduce spending after 120 days and 60 days. So Congress would have 120 days to come together and figure out a budget. That's the carrot. The stick is that after 120 days, the spending would be ratcheted down 1%, and then again every 60 days another 1%. So I think it's become painfully obvious that Congress needs encouragement to get its work done, and this certainly would be encouragement. And by the same token, you wouldn't have these government shutdowns. That gradual decline in spending, by the way, would treat all spending equally. So all discretionary spending would be treated the same way. No exceptions for liberal spending priorities or conservative spending priorities. It would be the same for everybody. Both sides in Congress would feel the pain. And both sides then might be more willing to actually get the work done. Now, is this the ideal solution, end government shutdowns? No, it's not. The ideal solution is that Congress actually does its work, which is our constitutional duty, the power of the purse, and that's to sit down and have these appropriations bills passed. That requires oversight of the agencies and departments, which are badly in need of it. It then requires prioritizing spending in 12 different areas. That's how it should work. This legislation, end government shutdowns, would actually encourage that to work, again, because it would establish this situation where instead of doing a last-minute deal where you can kind of throw in these provisions that Appropriations Committee members might want, you've actually got to go through the process. Otherwise, it just continues the spending from the previous year and then ratchets it down over time. Sadly, Congress has shown it's pretty much incapable of doing appropriations bills without some sort of pressure. The United States Congress has not completed all regular appropriations bills by the October 1st deadline since 1997. Here in the Senate, actually, over the past 4 years, during the current administration, the Obama administration, and under Democrat control here, the last 4 years, we have passed all of one appropriation bill on time. So that's 1 out of 48 has been done on time. It was a Milcon bill about 2011, as I recall. Congress does better with the deadline. And again, you see this with the debt limit and with what we just went through these last few weeks. We can do better. This legislation would keep the impetus for Congress to act without including the threat of another costly and destructive shutdown. I think it's a good idea. It's one that is already bipartisan, should be adopted by both sides. We had a vote on it earlier this year. It got nearly half of this chamber. I hope others will take a look at it. I think particularly with what we've just gone through, it's something that our constituents would think would make a lot of sense. Hope it gets the support that it deserves in this body. Of course, in addition to dealing with the government shutdown in this budget conference that we are meeting on this week, we also have a chance to address the debt limit, which is going to come up soon also, because February 7th was the date that was chosen there. Now, some say, well, the Treasury Department can use extraordinary measures to shift that beyond February 7th. I suppose they could. But instead, why not deal with the underlying problem? You know, why we need to extend the debt limit, which is the overspending. It's like you've maxed out on the credit card. It's really a lot like that. You know, you can spend only at a certain level in Congress, and then you have to have authority, statutory authority, to go beyond that limit. And when you max out on the credit card, you don't just go to the bank and say, I'd like to extend it. You have to deal with the underlying problem. Otherwise, you can't keep your credit card, and you can't keep your credit. So dealing with the debt limit is the other part that I think gives us an opportunity here. And over the past 2 weeks, I know that the administration has said repeatedly, even though we wouldn't negotiate on the debt ceiling before, even though the president refused to talk to Congress about it, which was unprecedented, by the way. No president in history has ever said that. But he said over the last couple of weeks, if you all extend the debt limit and if you reopen government, then I'll talk. So now's the time to talk. And the president should talk. I've worked for 2 presidents, President Bush 41 and President Bush 43. They did talk to Congress about debt limits. Why? Because it's a tough vote. Because our constituents get it. Because it is like maxing out on the credit card. And they want to know we're not just going to extend it again without doing something about the underlying problem. So this budget conference gives us the opportunity to do that, and I hope the administration will engage with us. It's been 4 years since we've had a budget conference. Think about that. The debt has gone up $5.9 trillion since we had the last budget conference around here. Almost $6 trillion later, we're sitting down again. And things are only going to get worse if we don't do something to deal with the underlying problem. The 2/3 of the budget that's on autopilot, the mandatory spending, obviously is where not just the biggest part of the budget is, but the fastest growing part of the budget. It includes vital programs to our seniors, for those in poverty, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security. Vital but unsustainable. These programs cannot be sustained in their current form. And by the way, that's not me saying it. That comes from data from the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. The President himself has talked about this. By the way, the Congressional Budget Office says that Social Security and health care entitlements alone are 100% of the long-term increase in deficits. Revenue's starting to pick up. The discretionary spending is now being capped. The issue is this part that's on autopilot. By the way, it's 66% of spending now. It's 76% of spending in 10 years. The health care entitlements alone are going to increase 100% over the next 10 years, based on what the Congressional Budget Office has told us. Now, I've heard rumblings in the press that this upcoming budget conference is just going to kick the can further down the road. In other words, we're not going to really deal with the issue. We're going to say, let's just extend the debt limit a little bit further and push the issue off. Well, I think it's time for the can to kick back. And if the can kicks back, that means we will actually tackle some of these tough problems. After all, that's why the American people hired us. That's why they sent us here. And if we're not going to do it now, I don't know when we're going to do it. I think divided government is actually an opportunity to do it. It's a time for leadership in the Senate, in the House, and certainly from the President. It's time to come to the table. As I said earlier, the President has indicated he now is willing to do it, do so in good faith, and try to put our country on a stable fiscal path. If we do nothing, by the way, if we allow these annual deficits to continue, they will more than quadruple. Annual deficits will more than quadruple to $3.4 trillion within 3 decades. That's based on the Congressional Budget Office. We've already got a debt that's about $140,000 per household in America. We're talking about annual deficits quadrupling. If we let mandatory spending reach that point where it becomes 100% of the deficit, which is what they project, if we allow our national debt to reach 2.5 times the entire size of our economy, it's about the size of our economy now, it's going to go up to 2.5 times the size of our economy, it will be the next generation that will pay, and pay dearly. And our legacy will be one of bankruptcy, skyrocketing interest rates, skyrocketing unemployment rates, and the collapse of these vital programs we talked about earlier, like Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. And again, this is not ideology, this is math. It's fact. And it's fact that's been reiterated by the Congressional Budget Office, the trustees of Social Security, the trustees of Medicare, their trust funds, time and time again. So this is our opportunity, Mr. President, to begin to do something about it. At least take the first steps, both in terms of ending government shutdowns, as I talked about, but also dealing with this underlying problem that everybody acknowledges and that has to be dealt with if we aren't going to have, for future generations, these issues of bankruptcy, higher interest rates, lower value of the dollar, higher unemployment. The single greatest act of bipartisanship here in this Congress over the past few decades has been overpromising and overspending. We created this mess together, and we can only get out of it working together. I've suggested where we can start, $600 billion in the President's own budget. In his own budget, he has $600 billion plus in savings on mandatory spending over the next decade. But whatever we do, I think we can all agree that we're tired of the gridlock, we're tired of the stalemates, we're tired of getting nothing done. It's time to make some progress, and this is an opportunity to do it. These past few weeks have been trying. They've been tough on the American people as they've looked at us and said, wow, are these guys going to figure it out? And we just kicked the can down the road. But we also set up this process and this structure. Let's take advantage of it. Let's use this opportunity to do something important for the future of our country and for the good of the people we represent. Let's seize it. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield back my time.
Mr. President. Senator from Delaware.
Mr. President, former Governor Manchin, I want to follow on the comments we just heard from Senator Portman, who, as he said, served on 2 administrations, and one of them as OMB director, another as trade representative, and before that a distinguished career in the U.S. House of Representatives. Somebody I'm fortunate to serve with on the Finance Committee. Have a lot of respect for his intellect and for his intellectual honesty. I just want to, before I talk about the real reason I came to the floor, I just feel compelled to say something. As former governors, Mr. President, you know, I had made tough decisions on spending. You know, I had to make tough decisions on revenues, and not always well received by people, not always well received by people in our own party. I like to say there are 3 or 4 things we need to do on this to get our deficit heading, continue to make sure it continues to head in the right direction. And I don't worship at the altar of a balanced budget every single year. But what I do believe is that when the economy is strengthening, going stronger, we ought to be having the deficit heading down. And when we're in a war or when we're in an economic doldrum, then I think it's appropriate to, in some cases, deficit spend. All right, 4 things we need to do if we're serious about deficit reduction. Number 1, we need, in the President's words, entitlement reform that saves money, saves these programs for our children and our grandchildren, does not savage old people or poor people. That's number 1. Number 2, we need tax reform, in my view, tax reform that brings down the top corporate rates to something more closely aligned with every other developed nation in the world. And at the same time that we're doing that, to generate some revenues for deficit reduction, to match what we're doing on the spending side. If you think about it, as Senator from Ohio knows, Senator from West Virginia knows, tax expenditures, tax breaks, tax credits, tax deductions, tax loopholes, tax gap, adds up over the next 10 years to anywhere from $12 to $15 trillion. We're going to spend more money out of the Treasury for tax expenditures than we're going to spend in all of our appropriations bills combined. If we could somehow capture 5% of $12 trillion over the next 10 years for deficit reduction, that's $600 billion. If we could match that in like a Bolt Simpson-like number, like $2 of deficit reduction on the expenditure side, $1 on the revenue side, we could do about another $2 billion on deficit reduction on top of what we've already done. Is that a grand compromise that I want? I think the senator from Ohio wants, and I know the senator from West Virginia wants. It's not a grand compromise, but I call it a baby grand. A baby grand is certainly better than kicking that can down the road. The last time we kicked the can down the road at the beginning of this year, I remember saying on this floor, we kicked a rather large can down the road, not very far. I'm tired of doing that. I don't want us to do that. And we have maybe our last best chance here in this budget conference in order to do the kinds of things I just talked about. Democrats don't want to give on entitlements. I'm willing to do that. But I'm only willing to do that if Republicans will give on tax reform that generates some revenues. I mentioned there are 3 things to do. The third thing is to look at every nook and cranny of the federal government, everything we do. And the senator from Ohio, Mr. President, is a member of the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. He knows that we focus, we have large, broad investigative powers, oversight powers, authority over the whole federal government, and there's all kinds of ways to save money. all kinds of ways to save money in this government of ours. Just like there's all kinds of ways to save money in big corporations, big businesses. And what we need to do is everything we do to look at that and say, how do we get a better result for less money in everything we do? I don't know if my friends from Ohio and West Virginia hear this from their constituents, but I hear from Delaware constituents and folks outside of my state these words: I don't mind paying more taxes, I just don't want you to waste my money. I don't want to pay more taxes, but if I do, I don't want you to waste my money. I don't want to waste their money either. I don't want to waste mine. Fourth thing that we need to do if we're serious about moving the economy and getting out of this kind of a rut that we're in right now is to be able to make sure we have some money around that we can invest in the things we know will strengthen our economy. Foremost among those is a strong workforce, capable workforce. Second thing is infrastructure broadly defined. Not just transportation, roads, highways, bridges, not just ports, not just airports, not just railroads, but broadband, all kinds of infrastructure-related items. Third thing, R&D, research and development that will lead to technologies that can be commercialized and turned into products, goods and services that we can sell all over the world. And the fourth thing we need to do is to really do an even better job. And Senator Portman's former leader as our trade ambassador, he knows what it's all about in terms of knocking down trade barriers. But while we do entitlement reform, we do tax reform, while we look in every nook and cranny of the federal government, we're investing in the three areas I just mentioned, we've got to make sure when we develop these new products and services that we can sell them around the world without impediment. We can knock down trade barriers, and he's done a lot of work in that regard as well. So as he leaves the floor, I'll just say I think there's a menu of things for us to work on, and I hope that we will. That's not why I came to Florida, but thank you for letting me join in that colloquy, Mr. President, to the Senator from Ohio. Now, the reason why I came to the floor is to say a word on behalf of the President's nominee to be our next Director of the Office of Personnel Management. We haven't had a confirmed OPM Director for the last half year. If you look across the federal government, the executive branch of the federal government, it reminds me a lot of what I call Swiss cheese. Executive branch, Swiss cheese. Just start with Department of Homeland Security. We don't have the confirmed secretary. We have one nominated, just nominated. It's just starting to go through the vetting process in the Senate. We haven't had one for months. Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, we don't have a confirmed Deputy Secretary. We have had acting for a number of weeks now, months. And while the people that are in the acting capacity are very good people, very able people, it's not the same as having a confirmed Secretary of Homeland Security or confirmed Deputy Secretary. There are any number of other positions in Homeland Security. And as Chair of Homeland Security Government Affairs Committee, I probably focus more on that than on OMB, Office of Management and Budget, to try to make sure that Sylvia Burwell from West Virginia, from Hinton, West Virginia, our President knows her well. Our Presiding Officer Manchin knows her well. And as a guy who grew up in West Virginia a little bit, born there, spent some time in Hinton, I have a huge respect for her. We worked very hard to get her management team or senior leadership team confirmed. They're confirmed. She's got a great team. We need to make sure that at our other departments that we have from the top to well down the ranks, we have really strong people in confirmed positions. OPM, Office of Personnel Management. The President nominated a woman I'd never heard of earlier this year. He nominated a woman named Catherine Archuleta. And Catherine Archuleta, I never met her, never heard of her. And the first thing I learned about her is she'd been the political director in the President's re-election campaign. Must have done a pretty good job if the results are to be examined. And maybe some people are troubled by that. If we just stop there, that does not define who she is or what she has done. If somebody looked at my resume for the last 12 years, I've been a U.S. Senator. If they think that's all I've ever done in my life, they'd be wrong. I've been privileged to be governor of my state, a leader, and as a presiding officer, chairman of the National Governors Association, one of the great privileges of my life. Privileged to be a congressman for a little bit, treasurer of my state, and before that, a naval flight officer for, gosh, 20-some years, retired Navy captain. And that's who I am. And that's not all of who I am, but that's a better resume of what I've done. People say all I've ever done is my current job or my last job. They'd say, well, he's not very well-rounded. I just want us to take a minute and and say is, I'm going to date myself on this, Mr. President, but a guy named Paul Harvey used to do the news, and you and I are about the same age. You used to say page 1, and they say page 2. And I'm going to go to page 2. And page 2 is just a little resume of some other things that she's done with her life. And I want to quote one of our old colleagues, Ken Salazar, who's known her for decades, and hear what he has to say about her. She's born and raised in Colorado. I think has spent almost all, maybe a bit more than half of her life there. She has been, from time to time, among other things, Chief of Staff at the U.S. Department of Labor, and she did that for several years. She's also served as a senior advisor on policy and initiatives for the city and county of Denver, Colorado. There's more people that live in the city and county around Denver, Colorado than live in a lot of states, including my own. And she has done that job. Before that, a number of years ago, she had a number of roles in the office of the mayor of Denver for almost a decade, including deputy chief of staff. And in a city that size, again, is bigger than a number of states, that's a lot of responsibility. She's been a senior policy advisor with the U.S. Department of Energy. She's also served at the U.S. Department of Transportation, first as deputy chief of staff and later as chief of staff. She's been a professor at the University of Denver. She's done all kinds of things. But she's a whole lot more than what people seem to say, well, I know what her last job was. Well, she's done a whole lot before that. I think that helps prepare her for this job. There have been a bunch of people that have been nominated to serve as Office of Personnel Management Director since the 1970s. I think this is the first time we've ever had a situation where the president's nominee, I don't care what party, Democrat or Republican, where the OPM nominee has required cloture, even roll call vote, since the agency was created in 1978. That's 35 years ago. I want to quote Ken Salazar, one of my dearest friends, who was our senator here, went on to become Secretary of the Interior, who's known Catherine Archuleta for, oh, Lord, 25, 30, 40, really all of her adult life. Here's what Ken Salazar says about Catherine Archuleta. He says that she is a terrific human being. He goes on to say that she helped create the modern Denver, as we know it, as Deputy Chief of Staff to Mayor Pena. She led economic development efforts throughout the city. She was instrumental in the creation of the new Denver International Airport. And Ken went on to say that she was a star in the Clinton team in the U.S. Department of Transportation. A star. I just want to say to my friends and colleagues, we got to get past this situation where I don't care if it's a Democratic president or Republican president, where we leave these gaping holes in leadership and confirmed positions. It's not good for our country. It's not good for these departments. It's not good for morale. And it's not good for efficiency. We're interested in getting things done. Well, you can disable the government by shutting it down, or you can disable the government and make it less effective, less efficient by making sure that we don't have key people in the top leadership positions. It makes a difference that people are confirmed as secretaries, as deputy secretaries, and these other positions. As the agency responsible for managing our federal workforce, OPM's mission is critical to ensuring that our government runs efficiently. And unfortunately, vacancies at the top levels in leadership have limited OPM's ability to fulfill its mandate. They've got backlogs in terms of the processing they're supposed to be due, and job applications and others, people applying for pensions, and they need to be addressed. And Catherine Archuleta, in her hearing, one of the things before a subcommittee chaired by Senator Tester, one of the things she made clear that she would make that her priority, going after the backlogs, and to which I would say God bless her if she's confirmed, and I hope she will be. But at any given moment, we're lacking critical leadership in any number of positions, just about every agency, and again, it undermines the effectiveness of our government. While Congress and the administration have taken some steps to address this problem, the fact remains that we still have more work to do to ensure that we've talented people in place to make these critical decisions. And this week, we consider the President's nomination of Catherine Archuleta to be the next director of OPM, Office of Personnel Management. I talked about a little bit about her background. One of the other people who knows her pretty well is a fellow, another senator from Colorado. She was there to introduce her at our confirmation hearing, along with Michael Bennett. Here's what he said about her, about Catherine Archuleta. She said, throughout her career, Catherine has demonstrated her ability to lead, her ability to motivate, her ability to work constructively with a diverse range of people and personalities. Her story is a story of firsts. First, neither of her parents ever completed high school. They worked tirelessly to create better opportunities for their children. Throughout her career, she serves as an example for women and Latinos and will be the first Latina director of OPM. The President nominated her to this critical position back in May. We held a hearing to consider her nomination. Senator John Tester held it and voted out of committee shortly thereafter. At her confirmation hearing, Ms. Archuleta committed to quickly taking steps to identify some of OPM's greatest challenges, continuing to implement the multi-state plan under the Affordable Care Act, reducing the retirement claims backlog to ensure retirees receive their full pension benefits without serious delays, many retirees see today, and recruiting and retaining the next generation of federal employees. I think we have a nominee who's qualified, we have a nominee who's been vetted, we have a nominee who's ready to go to work. It's our responsibility to give her a swift vote, a thoughtful vote, but a swift vote here on the Senate floor, I hope this week, so that she can go to work, take the reins at OPM, and begin directing this critical agency, with oversight from us, I think that's what I wanted to say here, Mr. Chairman. When you were governor of your state of West Virginia, when I was privileged to be governor of my state, the tradition in Delaware is the governor would nominate the people who serve on her cabinet. Tradition in our state was to nominate division directors under the cabinet secretaries. Tradition in my state is that the legislature, the Senate to which those nominees were sent, would hold hearings and would vote up or down without delay on those nominations. And I think in the 8 years that I was privileged to serve as governor of our state, every one of them was confirmed. Every one. I don't think I've ever lost a nomination battle for cabinet secretary or for division director. And that's the way we do business in Delaware. That's the way we ought to do business here. And if you got a nominee who's qualified, who has good integrity, going to work hard, surround themselves with good people, and has a track record that he or she can be proud of, that nominee deserves a vote. And let's give this nominee a vote, and let's give her a chance to go to work. With that, I say thank you very much, and I yield the floor to the gentlelady from New York State, the Empire State.
Thank you very much.
Senator from New York.
Mr. President, today is exactly 1 year